So in a way, I feel like I'm sort of home. Since I lived in Holyoke for a really long time. Both of my kids are graduates of Holyoke schools, Holyoke High School. And for a long time when I had the job at UMass Lowell, I drove back and forth. So it's a wonder I'm still alive. That I didn't find myself in a ditch somewhere on the turnpike one night late at night. But eventually, as kids often do, they both went off to college and decided they weren't going to return to Holyoke. They were going to go find what they wanted to do. And so I said, okay, either have to find a job around here or move to Lowell, because I really liked what I was doing in Lowell. And I figured if I couldn't find a teaching job around here, off I would go. And so that's what I did. Holyoke Community College wouldn't hire me. So it goes. Norwood, Mount Holyoke, and UMass Amherst, where I got my PhD, frowned upon hiring people who had graduated from their programs, which seems kind of weird, but it makes sense in a way. So they said, go away if you want and then come back. But I actually liked living in Lowell, and so that's where I am. And so I will talk at some point about my time working at American Bosch, and maybe a little bit about why would somebody who's now a PhD in history have worked at the American Bosch. There's a story there. And so maybe at some point we'll come to it, or if I forget and you want to ask me, maybe I'll tell you. But what I've spent a lot of time over the last several years trying to understand and figure out what happened to 3 large industrial cities in Massachusetts. And this year I'm starting on thinking about a 4th. The 3 are Holyoke, Lowell, and Lawrence. And Holyoke, Lowell, and Lawrence because there are several similarities between the 3. And I am now spending an inordinate amount of time in Worcester, trying to understand Worcester. The heart of the Commonwealth, so-called, but an incredible industrial powerhouse on its own, of its own right, throughout the 19th, well into the 20th century, before a lot of the industry sort of left there too. And I'm trying to really try to understand how is it that these places that are so prosperous, that have an amazing amount of industry in them, thousands and thousands of jobs, at some critical moment, things begin to fall apart. And why and how might the community, was it possible to stop the decline, right? That's one of the questions that I think a lot about. What happened, why, and was it some just inevitability of historical forces that made this happen? Was there a moment where people could have done something a bit differently and maybe turned things around? I don't have the answer, so if you're thinking I'm going to tell you that answer, it's an open question. That's the fun in a way of doing the research. I have my ideas, which I'll talk about as we go along. I'm happy as we go to be interrupted with a question. If it's something we're going to get to, I might just be rude and say we're getting to it, and sort of put you off for a second. But I don't mind being interrupted. The plan that I have is to probably talk for 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so, depending on how much I'm interrupted, and then leave plenty of time for a conversation, questions, whatever, discussions, your own perspectives and views. I'm always on slippery ground when I'm coming into, I mean, even though I've lived here, I still feel like I'm not an expert on Holyoke history. I think I know a lot about it, but some of you know what you know, different from what I know, and so that gets added to the mix. Last Tuesday, I was in Greenfield doing something similar, talking about Greenfield. And I basically said the same thing, and at the end, people said, actually, you were right more than you were wrong. So I appreciated that validation. But I mean, when you look at these structures, right, and the wealth that got generated to build these kinds of massive factory buildings in the city, and I may say Lowell, I know I mean Holyoke, so somebody throw something at me if I lapse into talking about Lowell. But again, you know, these buildings and the wealth and what it shows about the economy of the city and of the power of these mills, paper mills, and largely paper mills, textile mills, but also machinery companies that were building machinery for paper mills and for textile companies. All of this taken together really generated this incredibly wealthy place. And when I've done the same research in Lawrence, and I went to a middle school in Lawrence and did a talk about Lawrence and had some photographs like this of mills in Lawrence and talked about the wealth that was generated historically in Lawrence. And this young girl, maybe 12, 13 years old in middle school in Lawrence, she raises her hand and I said, yep, and she said, where the hell did the money go? And then she covered her mouth because she realized she had said hell. And the teachers were all kind of looking at her like, what the hell? But it was a great question, right? I mean, I thought it was like, brilliant, you got it. Like, where'd the money go, right? And so she got it, right? And so that's part of what I want us to think about. What happened, right? Where did all this wealth go? And so part of the story of the valley, right? So I want to talk about Holyoke in the Connecticut River Valley. Part of the story here is the fact that the economy of the Connecticut River Valley is jump-started in a big way by the federal government, by Congress deciding to put a federal armory, a gun-making enterprise run by the federal government in the middle of Springfield. And probably many of you have been through that museum, or you know where it is on the campus where Springfield Technical Community College is. But the fact that the armory got sited where it did along the Connecticut River Valley started right away making Springfield and the rest of the region that we're talking about a magnet for highly skilled workers, for a group of people that back in the early 19th century people referred to as mechanics. Now when we think of a mechanic, you say you're taking your car, right, to a mechanic or whatever. We don't necessarily think of the word in the same way. But in this period of time, these were the most brilliant people of the day in the sense of being able to think about and figure out how to design and make things. And so, in effect, for me at least, I think about this region that we're talking about as the Silicon Valley of the 19th century. This was the place, and again, maybe hard to imagine, but this area here, all the way up into Springfield, Vermont, had pound for pound the most highly skilled machinists, metal workers, mechanics, whatever you want to call them, anywhere in the country, for most of the 19th century. And that mattered because the places that built machinery and that worked back and forth with manufacturers ended up having the best companies, right? And so I'll back up and say it again. But I just want to show you so you can see I'm not crazy. Look at the map. Look at Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Look at all the dots. That's where all these companies are, these companies that build machines. And so from an economic standpoint, if you want to start a company to make cloth, or you want to start a company to make paper, and you're nearby people that make machinery that makes paper, or you're nearby people that make machinery that can be used in making textiles, making cloth, you stand a better chance, unless you're a moron, to outcompete everybody else. Because you have the best material, you have the best machines. Everybody with me? Makes sense to me, right? That if I'm across the street from you, and you're building machines that make paper, and I can talk to you and say, hey, can you do this or that to this machine to make the machine run quicker, or make the machine catch flaws more quickly so I don't waste and make too much scrap paper or whatever it is, and we sit and we talk and we do that, my paper mill should be better than everybody else's paper mill. And so that's what happens in the Connecticut River Valley. That back and forth, that set of relationships is what makes this work. And so you have a combination of the mechanics, the people who have the eye for building machinery, and you have that workforce, a highly skilled workforce, that knows as well how to work with metal, build machines, and you have a bunch of entrepreneurs who are starting new companies, which they're doing here, to basically make the two main products of the city of Holyoke, which are paper and cloth, right? And just so happens that around the area are lots of companies that make machines, make parts for paper and textiles. And this is a perfect working relationship. And so the valley, the Connecticut River Valley, the entirety of the valley, has this incredible competitive advantage for nearly 100 years. And it's part of why there's so much, again, what I think of as prosperity in the Connecticut River Valley for such a long period of time. This guy, Nathan Appleton, shows up in Lowell, shows up in Lawrence, shows up in Holyoke, a whole collection of people largely from around greater Boston initially that pool their money. History books call them the Boston Associates. They never thought of themselves as the Boston Associates. They never used that terminology. It's something that a historian in the 1930s used as a handy way to refer to this whole collection of people, and it stuck. But they didn't think of themselves quite that way. And so again, in contemporary dollars, $143 million worth of investment in the early 1840s, using today's money, right? I mean, that's a lot of money, right? Invested in water power, starting to dig and build the canals. Irish laborers largely building the canals, building the dam. I found this fascinating. In 1848, there was a strike of the Irish laborers who were digging the canals, and basically the strike is settled after a Catholic priest shows up. I'm not sure what transpired, but they ended up all going back to work. But by 1855, about a third of all the people living in what's now become Holyoke are Irish laborers. And the same pattern holds in Lowell and also holds in Lawrence. Most of the people that dug the canals and built the mills in all three cities are Irish immigrants. Not all, but a good majority. And for those of you that know your Irish history, the potato famine is hit. There's a fairly substantial migration, and this area becomes a magnet because there's work. There's a lot of work to do digging the canals. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do building the brick mill buildings that we see around us. And so this happens fairly quickly. In 1850, besides one small cotton mill, Holyoke contained 19 craft-based shops, so these small machine shops that I was talking about before. Brickmakers, shoemakers, harness makers, blacksmiths, you can read too, right? But just like all of this entrepreneurial activity, all this business activity, more mills get built, more small supporting businesses grow up around them, and all this again becomes really important to understand the Holyoke economy. So the factories basically need to be supplied, right? They need the raw material, they need these machines that we've been talking about, they need record books, they need all sorts of stuff, right, to run the business. And as these enterprises grow in Holyoke, around the city grow as well all these what economists would call supporting industries or supporting businesses. And so in a way, we can think about this as all boats are rising. All boats are rising, right? As people come here because the paper mills start to grow here, as people come here because eventually the textile mills are going to grow too, there's work for everybody. This is a growing economic city. I love this photo. I'm fascinated by, again, the architecture of these places. Built to last, right? I mean, just really incredibly substantial structures. I mean, there's a couple of flaws in the historical accuracy of the building, right? I realized after I saw the photo, wait, there wouldn't have been an air conditioner in 1850. That would have, no. never would have happened. But anyway, there's another one here. Oh well, you get the. I was going to say you get the picture, but that would be. Population is going to grow really fast. 1850, about 3,000 people. By 1870, it's grown almost 3 times. That's fast growth, right? To try to sort of build a complicated city. Doubles again between 1870 and 1880. 1890 jumps again. So this is growth because there's work, right? Which makes sense, but that's tremendous growth in 60, 70 years, from 3,000 people to 60,000, right? There's work here. So a little bit about some of these companies and what they do, and then we'll slowly work our way into what happened. Lots of, again, paper companies, lots of companies related to textiles. This company, the Merrick Brothers, comes and basically is into making thread, becomes a very successful, very prosperous company. End of the Civil War, paper manufacturers show up in huge numbers in the city of Holyoke. Lots of French-Canadian immigrants are going to come down to work in those paper mills. And so that's where the large influx of, we've already had Irish immigration, large influx of French-Canadian folks are going to come, largely from the Quebec area, kind of going to come down into Holyoke. 7 paper mills just built in a 1-year period of time, right? Again, really rapid growth. Hadley Falls Company, 5 machinists who had worked for them, get a loan from the water power company and start the Holyoke Machine Company way back then. Again, skilled workers who basically decide, let's go off and start a company of our own. We can do all sorts of things with metal, start a small company. Just a handful of years later, they employ over 100 workers, which for the day is a large company. That's a fairly sizable metalworking company in such a short period of time. So what they were doing, what they were making, obviously had value, and they had lots of customers. And we'll see in a little bit who some of those customers were. Some of the paper companies, these are probably familiar names to a lot of you. Parsons Paper, Holyoke Paper. I love how they, these are usually advertising images that they use, lithographs of one sort or another. They would send them around on postcards. They would, if you get a chance when we finish, I brought a map from 1881 of the city, and all the big companies in the city basically advertised on the map. Across across the top and down the side, and across the bottom of that map are photographs are lithographs like this, basically showing these companies. It was the way to advertise, right? There wasn't a lot of ways necessarily yet to do it. City directories they would advertise in, but these would be used for those sorts of things. Paper makers, highly successful in Holyoke. And supposedly, I don't know much about paper making, the chemistry of it all, but I'm told the water is like the best water for making paper. There was something about the water from the Connecticut and the way it was brought in through the canals that was, the water was devoid of a lot of harsh chemicals, and that basically paper during this period of time, paper being made, it was largely made with rags. They were basically rag soaked. And the quality of the paper was extraordinary. As you can see, Whiting Paper, which is one of the first companies that gets started here, wins an award at the Paris Exposition, which is like as fancy as one can get for being in a competition with manufactured products, and they win best paper. Tiffany and Company basically abandoned European paper companies and only will now buy from Whiting Paper. Because of the quality of the paper, right? Which again, that's pretty cool, right? I mean, so shows you the stuff here. This is I like this old photograph of the Whiting Paper Company. This is one of their ads. Whenever pen is put to paper, right? How archaic. we can see now one of the reasons why there aren't as many paper companies anymore, right? How much we've stopped sending cards and letters and, right? I mean, hardly anybody does that anymore, right? That's what people were doing. Where quality is desired and used, where good form prevails, there's a whiting paper for every purpose. When you think of writing, think of whiting. Somebody probably got paid big money for that. That clever little slogan. When you think of writing, think of whiting. And again, sort of, what's interesting is they're making the paper here, mills in Holyoke, Mass, but they have sales and distribution, right? And so I need a break, so I'm going to ask you all a question while I get a drink of water. So what? Why does that matter? Why is that important? Why would I even mention it? Think like an economist.
Well, there's a differentiation between centers of industry and centers of commerce.
Okay, but if you're distributing, if you're making paper here and selling it in all these places, I feel like it's tomorrow morning in my class. I'm already tired.
International markets.
Right, so what does that do for Holyoke? Puts it on the map, it brings money in. Right? The important thing here in terms of thinking about why, my first question, why did these companies grow? Why was there this profitability or whatever, is because the markets for what they're making and producing in all these places, not just in Holyoke, but in the valley, worldwide market. That means money's coming in. I mean, the value of having some level of manufacturing economy and manufacturing for export in some way, from a place to a whole bunch of other places, is now you're getting all that money from them, and it's coming into the city. It's coming into the coffers of the companies. If they're doing right by their workers, they're giving their workers more money. They're investing, they're building more, they're growing their plant, they're buying more machinery from the Holyoke Machine Company, or wherever else they might be buying their machinery. And so this is good, right? From the perspective of people in Holyoke at the time, the more of this that's going on, the better, right? And here again, paper trade journals began to abound in advertisements of Holyoke-made machinery and devices used in well-known Holyoke paper mills. 3 new machinery shops were opened between 1879 and 1882, as well as a brass foundry and one for castings. So the thing about this to sort of hold in your brain as we go forward is there's an upside to this and there's a downside to this, right? So I said all boats rise, which is what's happening right now. But when the industry starts going bad, it takes everything down with it. Right? Everything that grows up around the paper industry and the textile industry in the city of Holyoke, and the same story in Lowell, the same story in Lawrence, when it's going good for a big number of the people in those 3 places. But when the woolen industry in Lawrence starts going under, when the textile cotton mills in Lowell start going under, and when things begin to happen here as well, which we'll talk about in a second, it starts dragging everything else down too. And you know, right? I mean, just from being alive and living in the area, that means tax revenues begin to drop, right? All the kind of things that we think of today when we think of distressed places or, you know, cities that need some new jolt. They have the jolt. Great photograph in the Wisteria Hearst collection of the inside of the Holyoke machine shop. I mean, these, again, are really highly skilled people. Lots of apprenticeships. Lots of times kids are going to start at 14, maybe 15. This person here looks fairly young. They maybe go to an area trade school, like say Dean Volk now, or Putnam in Springfield or whatever, the equivalent back then of whatever they were. Get a skill, get a trade. So by 1900, there's about 3,600 cotton, wool, and silk mill workers in the city. 25% of all the workers in the city work in 17 paper mills. This is rag sorting. This was a job. If you lived in Holyoke all your life and your grandmother maybe or whatever worked in some of these mills, that might be in that photo. That would have been a job that a lot of people would have had. The other cool thing about the city as this is going on is that the water power company realizes that they have a role to play in helping start new businesses. So they become what we would think of today as a business incubator. They help start companies. They rent rooms with power, and they basically help people who, 2, 3, 4 people who don't have the money to buy a building, start a company, buy the machines they need, whatever it is. They basically will provide the space. They'll, if need be, come up with money to help people buy the machines. It's very forward thinking on their part to try to stimulate and move the economy forward. And then the plan always is that when they get bigger, they move out on their own. And then some new people move in, right? That's a lot of places now. I'm not sure if there's something here in Holyoke, but a lot of places, a lot of cities now have these kind of incubators in old mill spaces. Is there something like that in?
Yeah, they're working on it.
Yeah, and I mean, Back to the Future, whatever, right? But I mean, again, there's smart people figuring this stuff out. In Springfield and the rest of the valley, more investment. Robert Bosch, German company, moves into Springfield and builds this beautiful, which was this white brick structure on Main Street in Springfield, sort of on the Chicopee Springfield line. In 1911, by 1920, there's about 3,000 people working there, building starters for cars, eventually motors for windshield wipers for cars, seat motors for fancy cars. They become a major employer. Other people that take advantage of the metalworking skills in the area, Indian Motorcycle in Springfield, Winchester Square. Believe it or not, Rolls-Royce cars were made in Springfield. Not for very long. They had the misfortune of coming and opening just before the Great Depression. So they made cars for a few years. Our economy hit rock bottom. But if you go to the Museum of Springfield History, if you've never been there, they have a couple of the cars that were made in Springfield. They have some of the old Indian motorcycles. They actually have one, maybe 2 airplanes hanging from the ceiling. When you walk in, there's a big sort of amphitheater kind of effect when you first walk into the museum. They made airplanes for a while in Springfield too. They're hanging from the ceiling. I gave a talk in there when it first opened, and I joked to somebody, I hope that they had actually done quality control on whatever was holding up the planes. They didn't think I was funny. But it was kind of weird to be standing under an airplane thinking, okay. Another great photo. Early 20th century. I mean, the architecture is amazing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's just really something when you look at it. Some of the companies some of these clothiers and other people you may recognize. Horrigan Brothers, sounds Irish.
Child shoes.
I mean, look at how busy the street is.
I remember it like that in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, this was I mean, a lot of times, I don't know about here, but in Lowell, on the day that people got paid, they would close off the downtown to cars because everybody would be out shopping, spending a little money, doing whatever. And so when the mills emptied out and people had money, but this looks like, it's like a pretty crowded sidewalk. It's pretty incredible.
Thursday night.
That's probably a Thursday night, yeah.
That's amazing.
Right. I had to use some photos from the collection here just because it seemed right. There's 2 or 3 more here of some of my favorites. I just like the idea of people dressing up in a shirt and a tie to go buy shoes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just really amazing.
Notice the gender segregation. This is the men's section.
Yeah, definitely separate, right?
The white piece.
Now, I chose this one because my father worked at the AMP for 40 years. And so I felt like when I was putting this in the collection, I was communicating with my dad above. So letting him know I was thinking about what he did for 40 years as a meat cutter. Not here, but actually in Beverly, Mass, where I grew up. But I remember him going to work every day in a shirt and tie. For the entire time that he worked there. He went behind the meat counter every morning, put on one of those white jackets, had a tie on, white shirt, cutting meat. And they had shirts in those days, which I didn't realize until much later, where the cuffs came off, because the ends of the cuffs would get bloody. And my mother would just cut the cuffs off and sew new cuffs on.
Wow.
It was the way the shirt was made, right? But when I saw this one, it like brought back all those memories for me. And it made me realize why we always on Sunday had a roast. One of the perks of the job. But again, really interesting. So this is an interesting quote. This guy, Ora Stone, writes this fascinating 4 volumes, A History of Massachusetts Industry, which he publishes in 1930. He's the head of the Associated Industries of Massachusetts. And he travels around to every city where there's any industry and spends several days, and then the 4 volumes have chapters on all these different cities. And there's a great chapter on Holyoke with photographs and interviews he did with people. And he's essentially, saying that the city is really genius, right? Had these agencies, the Water Power and the Hadley Falls Company, had they been denied local and outside industrial capital, no doubt Holyoke would have remained a municipality of moderate size instead of becoming the seat of upwards of 160 industrial establishments, which annually produce upwards of $90 million worth of manufactured commodities. In today's money, that would be nearly $1 billion. And there's a way that you can figure out, there's a great website called measuringworth.com. You can take any wage amount or amount like that from a particular period of time, plug it into the site, and it will basically do the mathematics to affect inflation and all sorts of other things and give you an approximation of what. So that's what I did. So that's how I know. I'm not guessing. So again, that's crazy, right? Was that a?
Oh, no.
Okay. I was hoping. One of my favorite companies, Paragon Rubber, which was here and in East Hampton. They made dolls, right? This guy's making the molds. You can see for the legs, right? So there was everything here. Sewing the clothing, another whole business. And this is a great, the quality of the photo is also extraordinary, right?
Yeah.
This guy, Lewis Hine, who some of you may know, amongst other things, went around the country in the earlier 20th century taking photos of kids working. And the photos were used in part of a campaign to end child labor. But the quality of these photos, this looks like it could have been taken yesterday. It's amazing.
When did that company go under?
Not too long after this. The finishing touches. It's like if you have granddaughters or grandsons, I guess, to be fair, and they play with dolls, there's those American dolls, right, that you basically, different eras and whatever, and they're dressed in appropriate clothing for like the 1830s or whatever. This is that before that, right? It's really incredible. But again, the point here is to see the the enterprise of the city. This is the Skinner Mill. I mean, one of the things you're seeing here is one of the issues that's going to be part of what causes, to some extent, the demise of the industry. You're seeing a lot of technology here. I mean, there are very few workers if you look at that photograph. Incredibly productive on the technology, but you don't need as many workers as once would have needed, right?
So Bob, that one worker is responsible for that whole row?
Yep. And it could be, some places there's one or two. This is obviously a supervisor lurking. Yeah. And this is, I mean, this photo, so this photo actually is from Hatfield. This company in the middle of Hatfield, you know where most of you, I'm sure you know, I mean, Hatfield's in the middle of tobacco, onions, potatoes, corn, right? Agricultural community to the core. In the middle of Hatfield on the Mill River was this machine shop called Porter McLeod, which made these lathes and exported them all over the world. So again, the strength of the valley with these skills, you can see the little name here on the machine. I actually spent several days this summer in the attic of the Hatfield Town Hall, where all the records of the company were stored. The company closed in the early 1970s. It stayed open from 1875 to almost 1975, building and exporting these lathes. When they closed, they just walked away and left all the records. The building sat empty for a while. The Valley Advocate bought it, and they tried running the newspaper in there for a while. Then they basically sold it to somebody else. And when the next person in line went into the attic of the building, they found just boxes and boxes of records that they had just left. And so they got a grant from Mass Humanities to organize all the records and put them in some logical order for somebody to look at. And then they asked me to spend the summer looking at them and writing something about the history of the company, which is what I did. And in the records, we found photographs like this. But it was amazing.
What year is this?
This photo is around 1910.
That's interesting because there's no electrification here.
Yeah, no, they ran for a long time with water. They were sitting, so on one side of the river was the Porter McLeod, and on the other side of the river was this company called Shattuck Gunmakers. And they sat on opposite sides of the Mill River. They built a dam, and they had a turbine, and they shared the energy. In the summer, I actually went into the gun shop. The Shattuck gun shop has been turned into this really cool bed and breakfast in Hatfield. It's really nice. And anyway, the owner said, "You want to come down and look at the water wheel? It's still there." I said, "Yeah, of course I do." So we went scrounging around in the basement of the old building. But it's an amazing place. And just, again, sort of like, how's it there? Again, this level of skill. When I showed this one to my students, one of them asked if that was me, which I thought was very clever on their part. So all the way up into the valley are these folks.
Is that World War I V?
This is World War I.
Back, or what is that?
Which?
That right there.
What's in the background? It looks like
V for victory.
Yeah. Is that a?
Yeah, that would have been a war poster. So Porter McLeod in the middle of Hatfield, tobacco and onions and potatoes. During the Second World War, the lathes they were building were so valued, the military sent people to guard the plant around the clock. Who knew? I didn't. But here's now the beginning of sort of the downside. I'll kind of race through this so we have enough time to chat. So this is from Constance Green, who writes this history of Holyoke, Massachusetts. Publishes it in 1939. And she's sending out warning signals in 1939. She says, after the war, World War I, There was no reason to believe in great future expansion here, meaning Holyoke. Holyoke might hold her own as a small manufacturing city where adequate power, special knowledge of the manufacture of certain products, and a stable, intelligent citizenry gave particular advantages. Otherwise, the city had little to offer. Holyoke had attained her full industrial stature. So she's a naysayer here, fairly early on, but she sees something, right, that she's looking at when she writes this history of the city. And so here's what begins to happen. By the mid-1920s, the textile industry is what historian Bill Hartford calls a sick giant. The textile industry is leaving New England after the First World War. Makes sense. Cotton mills need cotton. Cotton is not grown in New England, as far as I know, unless somebody has figured out how to grow it in a greenhouse. It's expensive to ship it up here. As the country has grown, the center of the marketplace is moving further and further west. You're shipping raw material up into New England, and you're shipping finished goods down and over to Chicago or wherever. It's not competitive in the way people are beginning to think. Industry leaders are going now to textile workers in Holyoke, demanding wage cuts, longer hours, trying to figure out how to keep their businesses open. They're actually petitioning the state legislature to end state labor laws. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts has passed legislation limiting the workday to 10 hours and things like that. These mill owners are petitioning to try to get all of that thrown out. Between 1910 and 1933, 25 textile mills closed in western Massachusetts. That's a serious problem, right? Wages are also falling by 26%. So this prosperity we were talking about is being called into question. Holyoke mayor in 1937 in his inaugural address reports that Holyoke lost 42 million in taxable properties since 1927. So in 10 years, yes.
The population peaked in 20, but mills were closing during that time. Do you have an idea why people kept coming even though things were closing in that time period?
People are still coming because they still think there's work. And the mill owners are happy to have lots of people that they can pick and choose from as they're pushing their, but immigration, I mean, part of the flow is immigration, and immigration is really, the immigration figures in the country as a whole are really dropping starting around 1922, 23. And in 1924, immigration quota system gets set up so that by 1927, 1928, immigration's almost stopped, except for a handful of Western European countries. But Southern European countries, people are not coming anymore. They can't get in. And so people are going to start to leave here. People are going to start to move out of Holyoke and maybe follow the work south. Most of the textile mills are going to end up in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, places like that. This is Stone, a quote from Stone, and this is Robert, president of the Holyoke Water Power Company in 1930. Stone interviews Robert Barrett, and he says, which I think is right on target, the future prosperity of New England, in my opinion, is going to rest largely on the ability of the manufacturers to adapt themselves to changing conditions and changing demands. The manufacturers of staple and standard goods the manufacture of staple and standard goods is overdone. Success in the future is more likely to be achieved by the turning of attention to specialties and the ability to change with more or less rapidity from one specialty to another. He's basically saying you've stayed too long at the fair. You're making the same thing, you're really good at making it, the market is saturated, too many people are doing more or less what you're doing. Those advantages you had are not advantages any longer. So unless you can shift into new markets, into new specialties, if you want to keep making paper, do something different. Don't just keep making the same old writing paper or whatever. Yes?
So if the factories themselves have moved south and west, what effect why, what made them cheaper? I mean, we've been doing this stuff here so well for so long. Why would it be cost effective to move south and west to do the same thing? Is it transportation, I would imagine? I would imagine labor costs are lower. But is that enough to offset? I mean, I guess.
It's part of it. It's also the case that the people in Holyoke building machinery, or the people in Lowell building textile machinery, realize that their customers are now everywhere, not just in Holyoke or in Lowell. So while I said before there's profitability in exporting that machinery, there comes a point where the advantage that Holyoke has in having the best machines is no longer an advantage, because customers from all over the place are trying to get machines made from Holyoke machine companies that are making paper machinery, or from Lowell. Lowell has this gigantic place called the Lowell Machine Shop. In the 1920s, when the textile mills are beginning to close in Lowell, they're selling record numbers of machines to companies in India. They don't care at that point. Wherever their market is where the market is. Yes?
Bob, you didn't mention the transformation of the paper industry in Holyoke from utilizing rags to wood, pulp. Can you talk about that?
It's coming.
It's coming, okay.
Yes, good, but it affects the story. It definitely affects the story. To partly answer the question too of what's the difficulty or the problem, the canals and the river and these structures are great for their time, but once newer companies are coming along and building two-story, one-story, smaller facilities, organized more efficiently on the inside, Holyoke's kind of stuck in its geography in a way. Like, what do you do with that? Right? I mean, you can't I suppose they could figure out a way to float something on the canal or whatever, but again, while the canals were useful at a time, right, they now are somewhat inhibiting in terms of trying to figure out, okay, what do we do, right? This is going to cause in the 1940s and the 1950s, in a lot of old mill cities in New England, the approach of tearing them all down to try to create some flat space that somebody can come in and put a factory in. So here's the change. Here's what you were speaking about. Changes in paper making as well. Ragless writing paper approaches the quality of rag quality paper, and I said rag quality paper is what's being made here in Holyoke. And so other places can make paper more cheaply using wood, and that can undercut Holyoke's market for certain kinds of paper. The mills here are also at a disadvantage due to a lack of easy access to wood pulp. So all of that factors in here too. So all the advantages that we once had are beginning to go away. Anybody recognize any of these people? I'm dying to show one of these one day and have somebody yell, "That's my grandmother." No? Not yet. So here's the Holyoke Machine Company. This was sent to me just as I was leaving my house this afternoon, and I had to include it. Thank you very much. But you can see who's buying this stuff. These companies are everywhere now. And here, look, also Holyoke customers in such foreign countries. Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, China, Finland, France, India, Italy. All great. But all those places are becoming competitors for a lot of the things that Holyoke does. Right? So the market advantage, any sort of competitive advantage, I mean, this is a great find. I love having this because it helps make my point in terms of what's going on, right? And so you can see, I mean, some of these are, like the Pacific Mills is in Lawrence. I now want to go and do a search on where all these are and put the state next to each one of them. But I can recognize a lot of them that are Columbia Mills. That's going to be in South Carolina. So, while all this is going on, in the late 1940s, and here's the beginning, I think of what I think of as the death spiral. Lots of outside investors, lots of conglomerates, after the Second World War, are going to start to buy metalworking companies and machinery companies, machinery builders in the area that we're in. These companies have been successful. Conglomerates are looking, basically, think of big, gigantic, think of the, if you've seen long ago or maybe recently, the Michael Douglas movie Wall Street. If you think back, if you saw it, that's basically what his company does. Goes around buying up companies and then selling off the parts and pieces to make more money, doesn't particularly care about what happens to the community that these companies are in, has the famous line everybody knows, greed is good, right? And so that's happening. So a company like Worthington Compressor here in Holyoke gets bought and sold numerous times before it closes. National Blank Book, founded in 1843, moves from New York to Holyoke in 1881, gets bought and sold several times after 1970, and it closes up in 2000. This is a familiar tale. This happens over and over and over again. Up in Vermont, big machinery companies. These are some of the best machining companies in the world. They're bought by Textron, which is largely a defense contractor, but basically more of a financial holding company than a manufacturer. They don't know anything about making machinery, but they know that in the 60s, with the Vietnam War going on, there's a demand for war-related stuff, and the machine tool industry is doing reasonably well. They buy these companies, but when sales drop, they either close the manufacturers in Vermont or they shrink the size of the company. Van Norman in Springfield, which was actually on Main Street right next to where American Bosch was. It gets sold in 1958 to a company in Chicago, which shrinks the workforce from 1,500 to 350. It gets sold again in 1962, sold again in 1967, and again in 1972. That's crazy. So long-term investment, all the sort of things that would make a company stable, future investments in new technology and plant maintenance and upkeep, all those things go by the board. And eventually there's just a skeleton crew, and eventually the company closes.
Question.
Yes?
As these companies are being sold multiple times, what's happening to the purchase price of the companies? Are they increasing in value or decreasing in value?
The parts are worth more than the whole.
I understand that.
So they're in the value to the investors, to the people that are making the financial deal, they're making money. But the company is basically getting hollowed out. Workforce is getting smaller, no investment in plant upkeep, no investment in new technologies. And so this is happening at the same time. If you think about you have to think of the world too while we're doing this. It's not bigger than Holyoke, right? After the Second World War, we've basically destroyed during the Second World War the manufacturing capacity of Germany and Japan. After the war, we want a strong West Germany and we want a strong Japan. And so we invest in rebuilding those two economies. And they're going to come after our machine tool industry with a vengeance. And we'll see what happens in a second. So Greenfield Tap and Die, I'm going to go through this really quick so we can finish. Another big, important company in the Greenfield area. Same thing happens, bought, sold, same way. 1958, 1963, 1986, early 1990s, again in 1992, 2002. Gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller each time parts and pieces of it are sold off. So we lose this. I showed this photo in Greenfield last week, and there were a bunch of people there who actually, you can see all these motorcycles here. There were a bunch of people that had worked at Greenfield Tap and Die, and they said when it was really going strong and there were so many people working in there, it took 45 minutes to an hour to get all the traffic off of that road. as people left to work. There would just be such a crowd of people trying to get out of those parking lots. And then it shrank down. Springfield Armory closes. Early 1960s, Kennedy wants to cut, at least for a little while, defense spending, and he thinks that the way to sell it to the rest of the country is to make sure he's also going to do it in his own home state. And so he basically orders the armory to be closed. And eventually it's going to drag out a while, but it starts
Oh, he was a
closing.
senator?
No, he's president.
Oh,
Some of you might know people that worked here. I mean, all these places, right? These are all closing at this, all shrinking. There's another great photo. Sad one, but great. So this is really what, in a way, right, the politics of this. So this is where I need help thinking about this, right? Because it seems to me that Holyoke as a community was powerless in a way to stop this bigger sort of wave of economic activity, global economic activity, whatever you want to call it. And absent some larger sort of conversation about what we were doing as a country in allowing a lot of what I've been describing to happen to manufacturing, Holyoke by itself couldn't really do much. In Greenfield, they wanted to know about whether I thought unions in Greenfield caused all these companies to leave. And my short answer was no. The slightly longer answer was this was happening everywhere, whether there were unions or there weren't. So it's more a function of the larger sort of global economic forces that we've been talking about. So just look at this. This is 8 years. And I don't have all of them up there. I filled a page and got depressed and stopped.
I rode plenty of bicycles when I was a kid. I rode plenty of bicycles as.
Yeah, I mean, look at, and again, when you look at this, right? Years in, this is Springfield area, years, 80, 100, 80, 100, 100, 65, 100, 100, 90, 100, 80, 70, 75. That's like incredible. All in such a short period of time. That's just, it's mind-boggling. And so, one of the things that happens is right here, in this period, we go in the mid-1970s from being the world's leading exporter of machines, machine tools, to being, in 1985, the world's leading importer. So in 10 years, we essentially cede the industry, we give it up. From being the world's leading exporter in the early 70s to the early 80s being a leading importer.
It just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Doesn't make sense to me either. I mean, it makes sense on the historian side of it makes sense, but the actual doing of it. And the only...
It just seems like if you have this machine tool industry, now you've got a new demand around the world, you've got globalization happening, you've got a demand for that product. I get that.
Mhm.
But why did we give it up? I mean, if we still have a need for it here, to the point where we're importing from those countries.
Well, we're importing, yeah. Well, but here's the thing, because of everything we were talking about and the conglomerates buying a lot of these companies, like the ones in Vermont and such, those companies are no longer investing in where the industry's going with computer numerical control and robotics and all those things that are happening. And in Japan and Germany, that's what they're doing. So we're importing machines from Japan and Germany.
We're still making candles when the rest of the world is making electric light bulbs.
Yeah, it's a good metaphor.
I mean, really, we totally missed the boat.
Yeah, I mean, we right. And what's ironic is the original thinking and impetus for figuring out how to connect computers and machine tools came from MIT, from these mechanics labs at MIT. And they go on this sort of adventure at MIT in this lab to try to figure out how to build a machine that, that's essentially told what to do by a computer program. And they do it. But they basically have built a machine that's going to contour the wings of big, like, defense jets, right? So a wing of a plane bigger than this room, and a machine that's going to essentially machine the edges of that wing of that airplane. Whereas in Japan and Germany, they're trying to figure out how, like in that earlier photo of the porter shop making lathes, basic sort of standard machine tool that every company in the world has. If you're making anything with metal, you have a lathe, right? And so Japan and Germany say, we're going to build lathes that are computer controlled. And so that's what they do. And the governments of Germany and Japan help those companies building the machines by setting up, in Germany and Japan, government-run institutes that are going to basically create the programming software, so that it'll be a universal computer language that will talk to all the machines that are going to be built in Germany or Japan. In the United States, each of the companies that's trying to build these machines also wants their own proprietary software. And it's like ludicrous. Yes?
What was the period of the computerization or the globalization you're talking about, 80s?
This is happening a little bit earlier. It's starting to happen in the 70s. The stuff at MIT is even in the 50s and 60s. So they have the idea down, right? And so I'm finishing, but I'm gonna reminisce here if you like Mountain Park, which I did when my kids were small. That the part of the loss of so who cares, right? Part of the loss of all of this is that we end up being, all of us collectively as a society, we lose these sorts of community institutions and these kinds of activities, right? And so I don't know about you, but Mountain Park, when I worked at the Bosch in Springfield, and early in September every year, the union and the company together rented out the park for the day. And all the workers went to Mountain Park for the day for free. Kids rode for free, ate until they puked on the roller coaster or whatever it was, right? I mean, it was the thing to do, right? I mean, look, how cool is this? Anybody recognize anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me right there.
I drove those cars.
Right? Good stuff. Right? But again, we sort of lose these, we lose this stuff, right? Again, all these companies that would sponsor this stuff, right? I mean, it's interesting to think about, like what ends up being missing from all this. This is my sad tale of woe, and this is the last slide. That's me, believe it or not, with head in hand. Doesn't look like me, no? That's me. If I go like this. This is when the American Bosch announces that it's going to close in Springfield in 1986. I didn't know this photo existed, but in doing more research, I was poking around and I found out that the Republican did a whole series of photo essays on all these companies that closed. And when they did the Bosch story, this was the photo they used. And so I really like it because that's my daughter's artwork up there. And my son up above. So it's like it brought back cool memories, and this is them like staring at me thinking, okay, what happens now? But the Bosch is, again, one of these sorts of stories where it gets bought by United Technologies. When UT buys it, the first thing they do is build a brand new plant in South Carolina. And they say, oh, there's plenty of work for everybody. And we think that's doubtful. And we were right. And so in February of 1986, we're getting ready to negotiate a new contract. And they walk into what was supposed to be the first negotiating session and say, effective immediately, we're beginning the permanent shutdown of the Springfield facility. Have a nice day. And they get up and walked out of the room. So this is happening to everybody all over. Yeah, I lied. This is a sad photo, but this sort of, I mean, ultimately, the building burns down. Some of you may even remember when this fire happens in 2004. I was living in Lowell then, and when I heard on the news that it was on fire, I drove back. And there were probably like 200 former workers who were all across the street. It was now daytime, but we're all across the street, like looking. And I knew there would be I figured there would be people. I didn't think there would be that many, but I thought it would be an interesting way to catch up with people I hadn't seen for a while and talk about what people were doing and whether people had found work or not. But it's sort of, for me, kind of symbolic, and there is this one too, which is a more local one. And so, that's my story, and so let's chat. I'm open to any and all whatevers. Thoughts, ideas? Yes?
Tell us a little bit more about the path that brought you from Bosch to PhD.
So I was in, some people know this, but I was in graduate school at UMass Amherst. It's apropos that there's a fire up there. And I was working on my doctoral dissertation at UMass Amherst with Bruce Laurie, who was my dissertation advisor. And I was at his house actually talking about one of the chapters, and my roommate called and said, "You better get home, the house is burning down." So I drove, so Bruce had a car and drove me back, and the house was burning down, and so was all of my research. This is before computers and,
Oh my God.
right, saving things.
Your house in Holyoke or Lowell? Or
In, actually in Sunderland, at the base of Mount Sugarloaf. And so I felt like at that point, okay, like the idea of doing this all over again didn't necessarily appeal to me. And my kids were small, and I thought, okay, I gotta get a job. And so I did. And so that's how I ended up at Bosch. And when Bosch closed, for a little while, working with the Hamden County Employment and Training Consortium, I ran a project with some other people trying to figure out how to put out-of-work people like me back to work. Unemployed machinists, to try to figure out how to create training programs, new apprenticeship programs. There's still a lot of small companies around at the time, and so I did that for a while. And Bruce Laurie, who fortunately for me still was at UMass Amherst, kept saying, I thought it was me for a second, said, "You should come back and finish, you should come back and finish." And so I did, and then, so I finished in '94, and at the same exact, in August of '94, and then I got hired the same month to teach at UMass Lowell, which almost never happens. A total weird twist of fate. I went to talk about the community stuff I was doing. I was invited to give a talk at UMass Lowell. I knew a couple people there, but I didn't know a lot of people, and so I went and gave the talk. And when I was finished, this guy comes up to me, shakes my hand, says, "That was really good." He says, "I think we have something for you here." And I said, "Excuse me, but who are you?" He said, "I'm Chancellor Bill Hogan. I run the place." I said, "Pleased to meet you." And about a week later, I had a job offer. Like, that just doesn't happen. It was totally weird. Right place, right time, you know, whatever it was. And so it was a one-year contract, driving back and forth 3 days a week, another one-year contract. Then it rolled over into a regular job, what universities call tenure track job. So totally screwy. What I ended up doing was write about all of this. I had been working actually on, the dissertation was a completely different topic. I grew up in Beverly, and in Beverly there was this gigantic factory called the United Shoe Machine Corporation, which built shoe machinery. And when the factory got built, it brought in hundreds of Italian stonemasons from all over Italy to build. It was the biggest stone structure in the world when it was opened. And so all these folks stayed, and on one side of my family, grandparents are from Italy, and I could read Italian and kind of speak it. And so I was going to write the history of all these Italian workers and where they came from and how they ended up staying in Beverly, Massachusetts, which had a fairly sizable Italian population. So it couldn't be more different in a way. But, yeah. Thoughts, ideas? Yes?
Well, so thank you. This is very interesting. I guess one question that I have is, keeping in mind everything that you just said, what lessons can we learn moving forward? Because it's, in my mind, incredibly doubtful that industry is coming back to Holyoke.
Yeah,
And when
that
I
ship
think of-
sailed.
And when I think of successful Rust Belt cities, I mean, the first city that I think of is Pittsburgh. Also, I think of Lowell as being fairly successful.
Yep.
And, but, you know, for Lowell, anyway, it's within the orbit of Boston, which has a go-go economy, and Holyoke is not. So I'm curious what lessons you see in terms of moving forward for, you know, like these mill buildings that sometimes think like they serve their purpose, you know, for their time, but now,
Yeah,
you
now
know, what do
what?
we do with them? Should we just tear them down? I don't know the answer to that, but.
Yeah, I mean, different people have tried a variety of things. In Lowell, in the early days, after, with similar story, the economic development strategy was knock them all down. We're not going to move forward if we're living in the past. We can't move forward if every day when we drive around, all we see is the residue of this industry gone by. And so that was the common wisdom through the mid-70s. And so urban renewal essentially was knocking the buildings down, the thinking being that high-tech companies from greater Boston who could no longer afford the rents along 128 would move to Lowell. And if there was a patch of clean ground, right, where these, because it would, from what people were saying at the time, to convert one of these old mill buildings to make it clean for computer production or biotech or whatever, it would be too expensive because of asbestos, lead, the years and years of cutting oils and solvents in the floors and all the rest, right? But eventually people realized, okay, maybe there's another way to go. And so for Lowell it was to try to attract artists to leave greater Boston, right? Again, you're right, because it's close to Boston. Leave greater Boston, come to Lowell, find big open mill spaces to have arts, to have studios, create live workspaces. And so there are several thousand artists in Lowell now. It took a long time. I mean, one thing is that I think in all the stuff I've done and places I've gone and talked to people about this, one of the things that's hard to get, I think, across, and it's understandable, is you have to be patient. You can't flip from thing to thing, because nothing's going to change really quick, right? And so it took Lowell until fairly recently. I mean, now Lowell can make the case that 90-some-odd% of all the mill space in the city is occupied, one way or another, right? But Lowell had the advantage of having the national park come.
And Paul Saunders.
And although Saunders was in favor of knocking the mills down until he wasn't. Politician. But the park came in, and the park invested, between the university and the park, right, UMass Lowell is right downtown. So between the university and the park, something like $250 million in infrastructure investment in the city.
What park are you talking about?
The Lowell National Historical Park,
Oh, okay.
right? So that was one of Saunders' ideas. Yes?
So I was just gonna say, so.
I'll keep
Lowell-
coming back to your question.
Lowell has the university, it's close to Boston, has the National Historic Park. I was just at Mass MoCA this last weekend, and that's a beautiful, you know, artist space, museum, et cetera, but it employs 450 people versus the 4,500 that used to be employed
Yep.
there. And it looked like a lot of the people who were employed were, you know, the cafeteria workers and very young people, you know, standing in the rooms. And it seems like you can't create a vibrant middle-class economy just, you know, on the back of artists, because people have to be able to buy their art and afford
Yeah.
$20 to enter the museum. So it just seems like we're creating these really two-tiered economies, that the manufacturing base that created a middle class and wages that provide a middle class living. So it seems like that's great, and in some places it can work, but it can't be a strategy for every old mill town in New England.
Right, no, I agree. I agree 100%. I mean, I think if I worked at UMass Amherst, I would be camped out at whoever the boss's office is, saying, what the hell are you doing? Campus. You keep growing in Amherst, grow somewhere else, right? And I know the high-speed computing center is here, but that's the same way. It's going to employ a handful of people, and it's not going to be large numbers of Holyokers who need work. And so the university needs to be doing more. And I say this to the president of the university each time we bump into each other. UMass Dartmouth is doing a lot in Fall River and New Bedford to try to do business startups, business incubators. UMass Lowell has this very vibrant center for medical devices, and they've helped to start several companies. And they've created this interesting sort of corridor between Lowell and Worcester where the UMass Medical Center is. And so doctors and other people are working with these startup companies. They're doing everything from designing new kinds of beds to lift people, because one of the biggest problems for nurses is back ailments from lifting and moving people, to new ways to intravenously take insulin, or you name it, they're thinking about it. And so that's actually created a lot of jobs. And what the university did is buy an empty mill building in the middle of the city and build all these labs and companies, startup companies, just like the Holyoke Power Company in 1880. Companies come and rent time in a clean room, because the clean room to do biomedical research or whatever is incredibly expensive. And so basically, and it works out brilliantly for the university, because it's also a place then where graduate students in medicine and in bioengineering and all this other stuff get placements, get experience working, real time with companies. And so, but again, it's sort of the proximity to Boston. You can be between Lowell and Boston, you can be back and forth on the train in about 40 minutes. You end up at North Station, so you're right there where the action is. You can get the T to anywhere else. We're now getting lots of students who are living in Boston and coming out to Lowell on the train, which nobody ever imagined before, because it's cheaper to go, even though UMass Lowell is expensive, it's still cheaper than BU and Northeastern. So I don't know. I mean, I think the strength is I do think the strength is the collaboration with the university. But I don't know what the lever is to get them to actually care. I mean, UMass Lowell has to care about Lowell because it's in the middle of the city. And for years it wanted to grow, and every time parents came with their kids, what their neighbors told them was, Jesus, don't send your kids to Lowell. It's frickin' nuts there. And so
Unless you grew up from Holyoke.
they couldn't get anybody to come. So they realized they had to actually pay attention and think about, not just cosmetically, but for real, partnering, doing all this stuff in the city, which, to their credit, with much cajoling, they've actually done. And so it's a real positive thing. Yes?
I come out of the UMass background, and I know they're very concerned about developing the economy in the valley here, and they've been constrained for many years with tight budgets, so the ability to expand there in Amherst was critical to keep their costs down. In the last decade, about $1 billion has been put into the university in new facilities, and quite a bit of effort is being made in starting companies and translating the technology and science and engineering there into industry. But Holyoke has to do something to make it worthwhile for the university to want to operate a satellite facility in Holyoke or in Springfield. Now, the university's built a mini campus in the city of Springfield.
Right,
Try and make
base
those
station,
things happen.
yeah.
But Holyoke has to find some kind of competitive advantage, whether it be, transportation improvements, because it takes 40 minutes to get from Amherst to Holyoke.
That's the fault of the people that design Route 9. I don't know what we do, well, I can come over the mountain through South Hadley, I guess.
Well, they didn't send 91 through Amherst instead of straight up.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I think about this a lot, because the other thing that Lowell has right in the middle of the downtown is Middlesex Community College. Right in the middle of the downtown, right? And when decisions were being made years ago, and I know it's fraught with politics, but I'll say it anyway, building Holyoke Community College up on the other side of 91, in my humble opinion, was a tragedy. If that had been built along Main Street in Holyoke, or somewhere off Dwight or whatever in some old empty mill space, think of the shot in the arm that would have given to small businesses, other things all in that area. The amount of traffic that would be down there, the amount of foot traffic. And so again, the benefit to Lowell is on one end of the downtown is the university. On the other end of the downtown is Middlesex Community College campus with several thousand students. And that's huge for all day, every day, people coming in, right? All of that energy and whatever. And I mean, I love Holyoke Community College. I've gone there and given talks. I like, I like what they're doing. It's nothing against them. And the people that are there now had nothing to do probably with the decision at all. But think what a difference it would have made, right? I mean, it would have been huge. You were making the decision or no? Okay.
Maybe related to that, one of the things as somebody who's quite familiar with Lowell, but not an insider, the other thing that Lowell, I see that has done, that really has changed the way that city operates, is they embraced the diversity of cultures that are in that city. You go to the Lowell Folk Festival and you see every ethnic group has got their grandmas making their ethnic specialty and they're selling it at their booth and their table. They have the Chinese dancers, they have a whole variety of different ethnic groups doing their thing during the folk festival, and the music is extraordinary, and that's translated into restaurants all along that main street there. I don't remember what the name of it is, but there's a Mexican restaurant and an Asian restaurant, and all of those businesses have grown up just in the 20 years or so that I've been going to Lowell. And it seems to me, I'm not saying there isn't any ethnic tensions.
Holyoke had that. I remember when my kids were small, going to celebrate Holyoke down behind the Volleyball Hall of Fame. Saw Arlo Guthrie there many times singing about getting high, flying in over somewhere.
Los Angeles.
Right? Yeah, wherever it was, right? But I mean, that definitely was there in that space, right behind between the Heritage Park and the Volleyball Hall of Fame, right? I mean, Lowell has its issues too. I mean, there are two big issues roiling the city of Lowell right now politically, right? To speak to I'll just go really quick. So there's a big debate right now about building a new high school. And it's polarized the city. And the more affluent parts of the city, a neighborhood called Belvedere, they want the new high school not built downtown. They want it built on the outskirts of the city, as far away from the downtown as you could possibly be, but still be in Lowell. And everybody that lives downtown wants it downtown, whose kids walk to school, like from the neighborhood I live in. Kids walk by my house every morning on their way to high school. They're not going to be able to walk if it moves. And it's largely split along racial and ethnic lines because the kids that live downtown are Cambodian, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Laotian, Vietnamese, and I see them walking to school, but they're not going to be able to walk to school. And so that's polarized the city, and it's going to go for a referendum in the election coming up. But it's like a not binding thing. The city council already voted to move it.
But they're all going to the same school, right?
but they're all going to the same school, right? So, and the second one is how representation is elected on the city council. So Lowell is one of the only places left that everybody on the council is elected at large. Like here, there's wards and some at large, right? It's been that way since when I lived here. And so what it's meant is no diversity on the city council, no diversity on the school committee. And so after years of people trying to persuade the council to do something, a group of people filed a voting rights suit, essentially under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, saying they basically, no matter what they do, they can't win. Their votes are being canceled out, essentially. It's a little bit more complicated. I'm giving it in a nutshell.
It's like what happened in Springfield.
It's like what happened in Springfield, same thing. And so the city council, rather than say, yeah, this is right, like everybody, we're the outlier here now at this point, everybody else has changed, why haven't we? There was a hearing today, which I wish I could be at, but I'm happy to be here, in Boston, where the city was trying to get the suit thrown out. So I'm dying to get on my phone and see what happened. But the courts aren't going to throw it out, because the law's on the side of there being some, either all wards, all neighborhoods, or some combination of the two. And that split the city the same way as the high school debate has. And so those two issues have rubbed raw that you described. And so while there's a nice veneer to it, underneath it, like, people don't play nicely with each other.
It's always like that, right?
Yeah, and so that's...
At least they made the attempt at the veneer.
Yeah, no. I mean, again, not to take away from what's happened, but again, these are two huge issues that involve power sharing and respect for each other and whatever, and this is really the last gasp, in a way, of one part of the city trying to still say they're running the show and they don't need to listen to anybody else. And so, but, I mean, when you look at that, right, I mean, that's sad. I mean, I came earlier today. I got here around 4, and I just drove around. I drove by every place I used to live. I drove way down around on the other side of Main Street. I drove around in the flats. You know, I just kind of like reconnected, right? And it's for me, I guess, in a way, it's sad to see that, but to also know what I was coming to do, to say, damn, once, holy smoke, this was an economic powerhouse.
And then it was holy smoke.
And then, yeah, then in a way it was. I mean, one of my introductions to the city was when there was a lot of arsons in apartment blocks and all that sort of
Was that in the
stuff.
70s? Because that's when we had a lot of
Yeah.
But you don't remember me, but we worked together in the 80s, right after the federal consent decree with the schools.
Oh, okay.
All right?
Oh, Pat.
Yeah.
Pat. Okay. All of a sudden, okay.
The light went off, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Awful lot of similarities in the runoff as well. Just the subtle racism is still here, the divisiveness, the desire of there's so many people my age who want to have the 60s back downtown, and it just ain't gonna happen.
Not in the same way, right?
No.
Not in the same way.
Not in
And
the
that's
same way.
right. And what the economic engine is, I mean, the guy, Robert Barrett was prescient. That 1930 quote, he said it,
Yeah.
right? The quote that I read, we can't keep doing what we're doing. We gotta come up with something new and different, right? And so, I mean, I remember coming here when they were first starting to talk about the high-speed computing center. I thought that might be like one of the openings, right? That might draw in like other high-tech companies and whatnot, but I don't think that's happened, has it?
No, yes.
Yeah,
There's
it's
no leftover
mostly
power.
Research.
There's-
Universities, big corporations.
It's just a lot of computers to collect data and such.
Yeah.
That sort of, but it hasn't really spawned any sort of,
No spun.
yeah. I don't know, I mean, that seemed to me at the time to be one of the really interesting possibilities. Yes?
So I hear from my friends in workforce development that there are companies in Western Mass.
There are what?
There are companies in Western Mass
Oh, yeah.
producing high-end goods who are dying for skilled workers.
Yep.
Who just, the demand is huge and the workers aren't there. So is there a possibility there? What needs to happen to bring this together?
Some of that's right. I mean, there are a lot of these by tiny I mean like compared to these 2,000, 3,000 places, 50, 25, 75, 100. And I mean, there were hundreds of them back in the late 80s. So I'm sure some of them are still around. The average age of a machinist in the Commonwealth, the last time I checked, was like in the high 60s. So it's like a dying skill trade. Again, we were trying to figure out what to do to find jobs for people. That part of it was to try to work with like Dean Volk and Putnam and in Northampton and other places, right, where they're Westfield Volk, to try to get them to modernize their shops, train kids on more like what's out there in the industry today, so when they walk in a place, the machinery is familiar to them. But the trick is that a lot of those places, they keep saying they want people, they want workers, but they're not too much interested in sort of apprenticing people, getting people in the door and schooling them up. And it's really hard, I mean, it's really hard if you've not done that kind of work to just walk in and do it. You could have the aptitude for it, you could have the willingness to do the work and work hard and show up and have, like they always talk about, they want people with a work ethic, right? I mean, you can have all that, but if they're not willing, I mean, a lot of those photos that I showed you of the machine shops, there were young people there. And they went in basically with probably some voc or apprenticeship training of some sort, and then they learn on the job. But a lot of places that have 10 or 15 people, they don't have the flexibility to be paying people who are learning, right? So workforce development maybe can figure out how to subsidize wages or do something like that for like so many months or something where, you know, you pay X and we'll pay Y, and between the two of them it'll be a relatively decent wage, but
there was just a round of grants, but I can't remember the agency, state grants
to do that?
small companies in which they pledged to, first they're doing training, these are training grants, but they pledged to retain a certain number of the people they train, and they're being trained in the factory.
So did people here apply for the money?
Well, there's a shop at the end of my street that got some of the money, in Graham, small machine tools.
Gravy machine, is that what it's called?
No, it's got another name. GNC. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Gravy.
maybe, no, I can't. But in any case, there was a news story about it just recently, as if this is an ongoing program.
Mm-hmm.
So it's individual companies that have to apply for the
Mhm.
grant?
Yeah, and they can get the grant, and they can then, that subsidizes wages for training that they would not normally spend at all.
Yeah, and that's what's hard, right? I mean, that's part of the...
Find machines that know how to write a grant, you know, that's.
Right, and a lot of the smaller shops probably don't, I mean, the idea, like writing a grant.
Right.
Yeah, but the thing is, that's where the university comes in. It's got
Yep.
all the staff to teach these
Right.
people, or to actually write the grant for them.
Yeah, write it. Write the damn grant.
Or cities, you know, that have grants.
Instead of talking to themselves.
Yeah.
Yes?
I think you mentioned at the talk this summer something really interesting, how in terms of the culture, that machinists didn't want their kids to become machinists as we went into this downward cycle of the older generation was being laid
Right.
off. And then this sort of devaluation of manual labor and lack of appreciation for what it means to be a skilled mechanic, that's
Yeah.
really been lost from our culture. And so there's also cultural issues too.
Yeah, and if you had a kid that was thinking about, like, you know, going to Dean Volk, right, in the early 80s, and you saw that list of companies that I just had on the board that were all closing, why would you want your kid to go into machining, right? Auto mechanics, plumbing, pipe fitting, electrical, right? Like those kind of traditional trades, like learn how to run heavy construction equipment, those sort of things would make, would the way people would think about it make more sense than why do we want to train, why do we want you to do something that's dying away, right? So, no, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, people are making what I would think of as a fairly rational choice at that point. Why do I want my kid to spend 4 years learning something that then they're not going to be able to do, or they're not going to be able to find a job? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, out my way, a lot of the Volk schools for quite a while closed the machine shops. They just completely shut them down because no kid, they had like 2 kids, 3 kids, 4 kids, and they had 5 instructors, and so they just said, okay, we'll just close this. We'll put more money into high-end auto mechanics or auto body or things like that that seem to have some staying power. And the problem with that is once you close, it becomes really hard to tool back up again, find teachers, just sort of, and again, try to like, wait, this was closed, so what's going on? What's the trick? Yeah, I mean, in the 80s when we were trying to figure this out, there was money, we got money for like Stick and other places to buy new equipment or to lease new training equipment, right? So that people training, same way, after work training, people who would come in at an entry level and then go to Stick, a couple nights a week to learn something more complex. And the company, they already had jobs, but the company would help subsidize, and a grant would help subsidize. But the problem still is it's like a tiny amount of people in the bigger scheme of things, right? And so the challenge, not living here anymore, but just driving around, there's a big challenge to try to figure out, okay, well, what's the employment possibilities that are going to create some significant critical mass? That requires people sitting down and really thinking about all that we've been talking about, and also, I think, talking to the university. To your point of, okay, well, what's here that the university should care about, right? The problem is the mountains are in between, right? And so the university expands upward and outward, like into Hadley, right, along Route 9, out that way in former onion fields and pumpkin patches, and builds more dorms and things, but it's not coming this way. And Mount Holyoke College, I think, does a lot of social-related programming and stuff in the city, but they don't have the kind of engineering and science-related stuff that we're talking about, that, unless they've changed some since the last time I was there, to have that kind of presence in the city. It needs to be something like that.
Not so much talking about what could come here, but talking about what is here is Bay State Medical Center, which is a Trauma 1 center. And what Bay State Medical Center has done to the north end in Springfield is phenomenal.
Right. Where the Bosch used to be.
Exactly. But all of the ancillary stuff that is needed in equipment and supplies and technology and people related to Bay State, it makes you wonder if more of that could be provided for in this area, but there doesn't seem to be much of that going on. But
yeah, and that requires really purposeful set of conversations with them.
Right.
What do you buy? Where do you buy it from? If we could figure out a way to make it here, would you buy it from here? All of that stuff. Yes. Good time for one more, and then I got to hit the road.
I was going to say, well, hospitals kind of figured that out, and not just Bay State, but hospitals throughout the region. Dave and Walker are in one building. They have moved out into the communities and are very accessible to people, and you can actually, many people nowadays belong to them.
Yeah, in Lowell, there's a community health center, cleverly named Lowell Community Health Center. But it's in it basically rehabbed a big old mill building and put, from having have several buildings around you know, with like infant stuff in one building and elder care in another, whatever, put it all in the same place. And then that created, again, this sort of impact of having lots of people downtown involved in whatever. And so you can see around, it's been open about 4 years, but you can now see like all these restaurants and shops and other things that have all grown up around it, right? And so, I don't know, again, in Holyoke if there's that sort of thing, but, I mean, elder care.
There is, but
Well-
nothing's grown up around it.
Holyoke's
Health center.
uniquely named Holyoke Health Center.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Community
He's
health center.
he's been downtown for decades in the old Steigers building, if you remember from when.
Yes, I do, yeah.
Cosling Wakeland,
Near Oscar Vale.
yes.
Yeah, right, yeah, the former Oscar Vale, yeah. And unfortunately, you know, you would know better than, I wouldn't know why, but it has not been as successful as Lowell.
Yeah, and again, Lowell, basically, they got successful because the university has a school of nursing. And so the university had an interest in making that grow as a way to place their undergrads for all the sort of placements and rotations they need to get their nursing certifications. And so they started writing grants for the Lowell Health Center. And it wasn't something that the health center could do by themselves, but it worked. And now the Lowell Health Center employs probably 1,000 people in that one building. So it's doable, right? But again, it's talking about long-term. Yes,
HCC is opening a culinary center
downtown?
downtown.
That's good. They should move the whole thing.
Yeah.
All
Thank you very much.
right, thank you.